to move that around during Q&A, so just kind of keep that in the back of your head.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Amanda Hess. I write about the internet for Slate, and I am so honored to be presiding over hate today with all of these lovely people. So I'm going to introduce everyone right before their talk so that you can sort of remember who's talking when they're talking. And just a reminder, please don't clap, no matter how wonderful everyone's talk is. We'll clap at the end in the interest of time. So first we have Allison Annunziata. Thank you so much. She is a postdoctoral fellow in the humanities at the University of Southern California, and she's completing a manuscript entitled Sentimental Matrix and Russian Modernist Reproduction. Her work looks at love's literary history and examines literary form as a vexed space for disobedience and self-recovery. So here's Allison.
I hope you don't mind. Is this working? Yeah. I'm a bit old school, and I have absolutely no way to visualize what I'm talking about today. So I will be standing and giving my presentation. This is inspired, unfortunately, by real life, and so I'm so grateful. Yeah, is that better? Oh! And so I'm so grateful for the conference for giving me a forum in which to speak my piece. So the title of my paper is Love and Terror in the Digital Age. Don Quixote, Cervantes' tragicomic knight-errant who exacts moral justice using acts of chivalry, once proclaimed that, quote, love and war are the same. Both, quote, make use of tricks and stratagems to conquer the enemy. Or as it survives the contemporary celebrated adage, as we all know, all is fair in love and war. A trite parallel that cavalierly joins what should be contrastive spheres of interpersonal relationships. In this analogy, love is painted as pursuit, carnage, a challenge, an art much like war that requires stealth observation, covert actions, and is held to a set of standards set apart from quote-unquote moral society. Certainly there is a good reason for why Tolstoy revised War and Love to be War and Peace, realizing the first title to be an awful redundancy. The affinities between love and war as theaters of power often go unnoticed. An utterance of love is enough to exculpate violent acts. Even Don Quixote added a caveat that all is fair in love and war so long as the offender does not quote-unquote discredit or dishonor the beloved. Yet that which in time of troubadours was held sacred and central to fair play does not necessarily sync with what naturally comes of love, and war for that matter, in the digital age. The ways in which love can mutate into war the moment it hits cyberspace, and how its abuses are adjudicated and or overlooked, forms the central point of inquiry for this paper, specifically the extent to which love, when unrequited, is a phenomenon close to terror, and how one's desire and pursuit of individual freedom can outweigh another's pursuit of happiness. Unrequited love has long been sensationalized and popularized by our culture and made the subject of our most cherished novels, films, and fine art. The internet, a virtual kiddie pool overflowing with methods and opportunities to pursue the object of your affection, sets the game of unrequited love in motion. This matched with an unstoppable force of a culture that encourages bad behavior, I might argue, assuring us that love consists in never giving up. Lovelorn climb through windows, wait outside doors, and watch from afar. Desperate though it may be in their relentless pursuit, the lovelorn do just enough to be rewarded with their prize, who will eventually succumb to their will. The object of affection rewards the lovelorn with the love that is coerced, and for this sacrifice, the lovelorn loves him or her back. This trajectory, canonized by popular culture, seems potentially harmless if and only if one discounts the dangers of our increasingly digitized and monitored reality. As we like to imagine it, the internet is an almost perfect embodiment of the democratic ideals of free speech and open communication. And citing free speech and freedom of quote-unquote peaceful expression is one way in which we protect our democracy, both within and without the internet's permeable borders. The line deciding where peaceful expression begins and ends comprises the majority of legal debates and is the fuel for most internet warfare. Cyberspace has several, albeit weak, ways of preserving the internet as a safe space of communal activity, and for limiting to the extent to which it can be used for love and or war at its worst, For instance, the laws that protect against cyberterrorism, stalking, and harassment. Cyberterrorism is defined in two directions, just for your well-being. One is effects-based, which includes hacking and other disruptive behavior, and the other is intent-based, which is when the computer itself is used to terrorize a group for political reasons. Both are adjudicated harshly. Similarly, the laws of love in both cyber and real worlds have two categories: harassment and stalking. Counts of harassment results in the law's equivalent of a slap on the wrist, while stalking violations in the most ideal circumstances can result in a misdemeanor or, if repeated, possibly a minor felony charge. Though cyber stalking and harassment often lead to terror, and I unfortunately speak from personal experience, a member of LAPD's cyberterrorism unit informed me that terrorism is a misnomer for stalking if the perpetrator declares he is in love with the victim. According to our law's philosophy, love cannot be politically motivated. It is not indiscriminate and is not widespread, but is rather parochial in its aim. Simply put, stalking affects one, terrorism affects many. However, the law's discretion overlooks the similarities between love and terror when love is abused and when its laws are violated, and refuses to acknowledge that love not only behaves politically, but is also the root of the modern subject and its political expression. Cybercrime is tough to identify and prosecute because in order to protect free speech especially, the statutes in place require proof of what is referred to as quote-unquote credible threat. The test for a credible threat is whether a reasonable person would fear for his or her safety or the safety of his or her immediate family. For example, a stalker may send a note saying, quote-unquote, I am feeling dangerous, but unless he also encloses an image of a bullet, or actually a bullet itself, if it's physical mail, in the email, the credible threat is merely implied, and even then so only implies to the victimized party and is not necessarily legible to what the law would call a reasonable person. In a terrible irony, victims are often the only ones with the right intelligence to perceive the violation, and thus they alone bear the heavy burden of proof. Cyber or not, the laws view stalking as a crime of conduct, not necessarily of words. And if words might possibly be taken on the level of severity of physical conduct, then they must be fighting words, which is a loose and subjective category of speech unprotected by the First Amendment that handles language only on its most hyperbolic level. The supposedly weak-willed, I am feeling dangerous, must be replaced with the bold-faced, I want to kill you, if it is to be cognitively registered by the law. The language is far more complex and multi-layered than the law is willing to admit or possibly able to handle. Our body politic does not possess a literary imagination and appears tone-deaf to language's nuances and the resulting irony, satire, and play on words that, on the one hand, make my job as an academic so interesting, yet on the other hand, make crimes of language like cybercrimes impossible to identify properly. Convincing law enforcement of credible threat can amount to an infuriating confrontation of literary and literal languages, which is basically the equivalent of screaming into a void, wherein veiled language such as metaphor, allusion, allegory, or even just I am feeling dangerous are taken at face value by the aphasic judicial eye. Wherein an utterance of love means that what ensues cannot be terror. And if there is one crucial difference dividing love from war, it is that while war and terror are considered worlds of action, both on and off the internet, love is constricted or fated as a world of language, no matter where it lives. Yet cyberstalking needs to be reread as the intersection of the world of conduct and the world of words, or rather where the world of words is thrown into action. Love in the digital age either should be judged by literary laws or should be acknowledged as a phenomenon that is capable of masquerading as terror, particularly in our increasingly modern reality. In my professional world, as Amanda so kindly introduced me, I manage this topic on an innocuous level and scrutinize moments in which terror and love intermingle in literary form. And in this unfortunate collision of my professional and personal world, I have discovered that literary life and cyber life are not all that distinct. Both explore possible worlds, seek the unimaginable, and editorialize the everyday. However, for instance, if we know, in Shakespeare, Richardson, even Cervantes, it is literary form that ultimately controls this activity. It confines the angry heart to the 140 syllables of a sonnet, puts a stop on unrequited desire within the epistolary novel, or in satire reveals love for what it truly is, an imaginary force that generates illusions and sees what it wants to see, hears what it wants to hear. In literature, abuse is limited to what the form can handle. The internet, to the contrary, is the ultimate freeform, the anti-genre, the world without control and with loose poetic conventions. And if love's laws are at their heart literary, then the genres codified by the internet, the hashtag, the tweet, hypertext, blog, create new laws that respect not forms, but rather formats. And somewhere in this generic breakdown, from a sonnet's 140 syllables to a tweet's 140 characters, love as we know it becomes mismanaged, amorphous, and subject to bad behavior. It is worth noting that there are two central problems that must be addressed. One we have already established, which is that technology moves faster than the law. If the internet is to remain even partially democratic, then technology should progress in time with the law charged with keeping it strictly to the straight and narrow. However, the internet is merely one of many adulterated offshoots of our free market, which jeopardizes the safety of citizens for capital gain. The policy of our global economy is to forego preventative measures and to ask for forgiveness later. And the portrait of globalization within the internet's frame is the very same. It presents itself as the only cure for problems it itself creates, is responsible for cultural collapse and the creation of a melting pot without quality control. Obviously, there are virtues as well, but this is a paper on its vices. Unfortunately, cyberstalking is where our worst global policies match our worst social policies, as the very same laissez-faire attitude applies to violent crimes against women. The majority of stalking cases end in violence, with law enforcement seeking forgiveness from families. I've seen this in many documents. I wish there was more we could have done come from the mouths of law enforcement. Unfortunately, there is plenty more, all of which starts with ceasing to wait until harassment reaches a level of violence, placing the critical hour in the earlier stages of violation, and by acknowledging that violence comes in the form of emotional abuse. Quote, "I'm going to keep writing you and pursue you one-sidedly. You talk too much. I'm just handing you the rope. You'll hang yourself." This is an email I received in 2011, one of thousands vitriolic emails to litter my inbox starting in 2009 to the present day, from an individual who has used the internet to slander me, destroy my professional credibility, and terrorize me, my friends, my colleagues, and at his worst, my family, using every site imaginable to deploy hate. Facebook, Google+, Instagram, SoundCloud, Etsy, if you can imagine that. Mountain Project, which apparently is only popular in California. You probably don't know what I'm talking about. Even memorial websites dedicated to lost friends. Most significantly, he used the internet as a tracking device, both in the US and abroad, and came to find me at my place of work. But before the stalking became a real-life threat and was just confined to emails, it was impossible to convince law enforcement of the violent language. "He is just in love with you," is a popular juvenile refrain. Moreover, the restraining order I was eventually granted by the Los Angeles city attorney functions only in the world of physical proximity and flounders miserably in the geo-expansiveness of the internet. The laws designed to protect stalking victims, though now applied to the internet, still operate mindful only of its physical world. Though the legal language protects me from email contact, law enforcement will not mobilize if the terror is confined to language. Unfortunately, because protective orders are anything but protective, because law enforcement allots more weight to his freedom to speak and to behave as he chooses than to my right to a happy life, this matter remains unresolved, and it is on me to generate the means to regulate this harassment in perpetuity. To a mild extent, I am fortunate to live in Los Angeles, which, thanks to Hollywood, has the strictest anti-stalking legislation in the country. And it's interesting to note that what used to be distinctly Hollywood crimes, that is stalking, harassment, the basic prices of celebrity, are now in our technocracy reproduced on the level of the everyday. Data mining in cyberspace provided my aggressor with a wealth of information with which he could feed his delusion. For instance, he believed that my paper title in another conference, made public on a conference's website, sent him mixed signals, or my photo posted on my job's website depicted me thinking of him. Erotomania now thrives at the local level. Just in doing our jobs, we are involuntarily and flippantly turned into everyday celebrities. Fear kept me from putting this to paper for a very long time. You should not poke an angry bear, and I am only now coming out from under the covers of this experience. And I would be remiss not to illuminate the overarching irony that colors this very paper at this very conference, in this very moment in time. For a victim of cyber and real-life stalking, the thought of committing to a conference that asks for a photograph and a personal blurb, and now I know is also posted on the internet live, for the World Wide Web to see, is tantamount to self-victimization. I feared that my aggressor would suss out the information, and come find me here. Oh wait, I'm sorry. Which sets out the information, chart my coordinates, and come find me here. And then I realized that there is no better demonstration of the internet's ambivalence, of its double-edged quality as a space of freedom and, most importantly for me, a space of violation, than the meeting here of my aggressor, of a victim and a victimizer, versions of which could have only been produced and brought together by the internet. And rather than continue to fight for the laws to be upheld and protect me, I rather wish there was a form of remediation for the situation. But is diplomatic intervention possible for love and war? I constantly ask myself. Or is love, like war, a state of emotional collision that exceeds the bounds of diplomacy's capabilities? Is it, in essence, a dynamic too far gone for remedy? If so, we readily accept this reality as part of our cultural history that dictates that love and war are worlds devoid of absolute principles defining right actions. Consequently, we are forced then to accept that all is fair. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Next, we have Carolyn Cinders. She is, if I can read, Carolyn is an interaction designer, artist, game design, and user researcher from New Orleans. During the day, she works at IBM Watson as an interaction designer, and at night, she makes weird, experimental, narrative, almost video games. Thanks, Carolyn.
Hi. Oh, can you guys hear me? Hi, I'm Caroline. I'm an interaction designer for IBM Watson. I make a lot of things, and I make games. For this presentation, this is probably a much more accurate description of me. 2 days ago, I completely remade this presentation, and I really struggled with how honest to be, but I believe in transparency, so last Saturday, my mom got swatted, and I found out it was meant for me. Swatting, if you don't know, is a harassing tactic where the harasser trolls the SWAT team into being deployed to a victim's home under false pretenses, often violent ones. While at work, over the phone, I had to explain what Gamergate was, because this was a Gamergate-related swatting, to my mom and my mother's local police. And they asked really normal questions. What did you say, Caroline? Who's mad at you? What is your relationship with them? And why? Why are they mad at you? And my answer was really evocative to what a lot of victims of online harassment feel. I don't know who's mad at me, and I've never met them. I've never interfaced with them. And what did I say? Well, I tweet about feminism and mozzarella sticks and video games and open source and transparency. So, and I could go on, and I'm explaining all of this to the police who have no idea what I'm talking about, and my mom. And I realized we as a culture talk about online harassment as though it's one-to-one to offline harassment, and it's not. And we've been talking about the same, we've been treating it the same way. And we've been doing that the same with online communication as well as offline. They're similar, they're akin, but they're not identical. Running into someone in the street and saying hi is not the same to talking to someone on Yik Yak or Whisper. So we need to design, understand, and deal with offline harassment and online harassment as separate but very equally serious components. This was the original starting slide to my presentation, and it's still true. Twitter has a UX problem. But most communication platforms do. Twitter is a very specific problem, specifically around harassment, which I'm using Gamergate in this presentation as a case study to test some design interventions I made later in this presentation to test their robustness. And for the record, the design interventions I made to sort of stem online abusive tweets work 100% of the time when I test them against the amount of the types of people I had to block and these specific users. So anyway, we've designed our social networks incorrectly, and they're broken black boxes of communication we've come to love and we use every day. And it wasn't our fault we originally built them broken. We didn't know what we were building. And they were built by people who didn't really have to deal with harassment on a daily basis. 4 white guys built Twitter, and they built it in 2006, and they didn't even build it to originally have responses. So harassment wasn't really what they were thinking about. And just as the way the first cars were built were not safe at all, they evolved and got airbags and seatbelts. And right now, we need seatbelts. Communication design facilitates and disseminates language within the platform layout and interaction design choices for that social network. How you log on, where you log on, how you friend people, how you interact with them, where you see your notifications, can you even group friends? These are all design choices someone made that then influences the flow of our language within that platform. And then it generates a new type of language. Language is fluid and evolves constantly. And these communication designs are kind of broken. And they're broken because we never really understood digital consent, and we never designed for it. When we first made these platforms, we thought that consent was simply logging on. But a log on is not an opt-in. It's actually basic existence. It's more akin to birth. You don't choose to be born, you just are. So we don't really have consent at all, if you think about it, on digital platforms. And we don't have consent the way we have it with offline conversations. For example, Twitter's communication design is really open. In fact, it used to be a protocol, so you could have built your own ideal Twitter a while ago, but now it's a product. Sorry, I know it's a dark kind of GIF. And there's no filtering from that stream. It's an open stream, and that's why we like to use it. And it's a mixed identity space. It's aliases and real names. It's a professional and personal platform. And I would even argue it's a brand new type of interaction. It's a casual professional sphere that feels personal. That doesn't make it only professional and only personal. It makes it a brand new thing. And there's no real way to sort of enact any filtering or stemai anything from that stream unless you choose to go private. And you kind of can't hide. And the decision to go private is one where you either choose to be unreachable and outside of that network and safe, or you choose to be open and vulnerable. And Twitter is an amazing example of how poorly we've designed for consent. A block button, for example, is the end of the pipeline resolution tool to handle harassment after it's occurred, and making an account private doesn't feel very consensual either. And it's important to highlight that the interaction design choice, like to keep a stream of Twitter, is very specific, and that's why we like Twitter. It's the communicative and identity role of Twitter. This is a specific type of platform design. And there's a way to design against harassment that will not change the communication style that we love of Twitter. In real life, I have affordances and contextual clues to conversations. I have a lot of consensual opt-ins that I don't even have to talk about, that we aren't even aware of, but they're there. And we do not have those online. We need to add in affordances like filtering to our social networks. So I looked at a variety of online social media sites to understand more about communication design and moderation. All of these are contextual based. They are based around boards, they have mods, they have rules. Metafilter you have to pay to even join. It's $5, it's great. Stack Overflow, you have to answer questions before you can even pose questions. And all of them do have rules, even 8chan, but they say that revenge porn is fine, just, FYI. Google Plus and Facebook are networked interactions that are conversational around postings but include more context for the user. You can group users, make things hidden or private for certain groups, and allow certain circles of friends or friends of friends to see your posting. It's good. There's a lot of tailoring going on the extent of the user's social interactions, and this is not the case with Twitter. These communication platforms have facilitated and engendered, pun intended, new ways of digitized social communication. Hashtag is a real word now. It's a real thing we do. So is Throwback Thursday. We share visually in tiny sentences and small movies. We talk, so to speak, differently now, and that's not a bad thing, it's just a new thing. And it's how something like Gamergate caused such an effect in such a short amount of time. It benefited and worked really well for the platform it was on. It was tailor-made for 8chan, 4chan, and Twitter, areas with questionable or no moderation. So what's Gamergate? Because we're short on time, this is what I came up with I thought, as a digital ethnographer, the best sort of definition of what Gamergate is. And it's also a hate group. A hate group incites violence against specific types of other groups. Gamergate has really gone out of its way to choose to attack female writers and game designers. What are their harassment tactics? Because these tactics are really of the digital sphere, even though they have offline components. It comes from a digital space. And we need to define what digital online harassment is. And their harassment tactics are abusive tweets, saying mean things to someone in a tweet, doxing, the release of personal documents such as addresses, social security numbers, phone numbers, emails, swatting, having the SWAT team sent to someone's house, sea-lining, that's interjecting in conversations and asking in a very insincere but polite way for more evidence, please. Dogpiling, multiple users attacking one user in particular and over again tweeting or creating new accounts. There's no way for the user being attacked to then respond to all the accounts or on their own block the accounts. And we need to talk about these new types of harassments, and we need to define them and make them real things. They provide legitimacy to victims suffering from them, and we need to understand how to deal with them, and we need to not talk about them and deal with them the way we deal with offline things. I think one thing to really keep in mind is that offline harassment is often very personal. You are aware of the person that is attacking you. Online is decontextual, it's non-personal, even though it feels personal. This isn't about Zoe Quinn or Caroline Sanders the person. It's about tweet Lorem Ipsum and then at Caroline Cinders and then a picture that is an avatar of myself. It's about we are not quite ourselves online. It's not personal. Hate crimes in cyberspace gets into this really well when abusive commenters are confronted via the phone and apologize, saying they were not quite themselves. Our communication is sort of this. It's networked, unsiloed spider webs of interactive videos, images, and words, all tied to a data map that almost make up a real person, at and then whatever your Twitter handle is. So legally, what can we do about this? Alison got into this beautifully, and just to sum up, there kind of isn't a whole lot we can do. A larger problem is that our law enforcement agencies have a lack of knowledge about digital harassment because it's something they've never had to deal with before. I encourage you to call your local police and ask them about swatting. They will not know. But there's a lot that Twitter can do. Twitter can rewrite its community guidelines. It can be transparent, as opposed to sending memos internally saying, we suck at harassment. Why don't you tell your users that? They can look at Block Together. Randy Harper, a victim of Gamergate, created a tool to stem harassment. It's almost machine learning. So you follow Block Together, you enact this list. It blocks the followers of known large Gamergate accounts. They can redesign their interface. Riot Games League of Legends redesigned their chat interface to be opt-out by default and saw a 17% decrease in harassment within chat. They can allow for user agency. They can allow for the user to select the extent of their social circles by enacting different filters of who and how people can contact with them. And they can use algorithms and data smarter by enacting the PGP Web of Trust, which is sort of like 6 degrees of separation. It's saying that friends of friends are safe people for you to interact with. They should not rely on algorithms solely. They should not use natural language processing to filter out harassing tweets, which they're already doing for verified users. This sort of places an emphasis on the English language, and I'm sure harassment occurs in Chinese and Arabic. They should not track IP addresses, and they should not force users to use their real names. Surveillance is not safety, and the last two can really be used against marginalized groups to impede upon their privacy. But Twitter can just be radical and trust their own users. The ability to tweet is universally persistent throughout Twitter in the nav bar. I'm suggesting that they add a button right next to where you can tweet. That sends the user immediately to their privacy settings where they can enact a variety of filters, such as accounts under a certain age cannot tweet at you, friends of friends are safe to tweet at, or to receive tweets from. Accounts that have a certain amount of followers cannot tweet at you, allow the account to look public but act private. And these are just examples I've created that I have tested against the abuse I received from Gamergate, and if I could have enacted these, I wouldn't have had to deal with that. They can do something even better. They can enact batch block reporting, and this is where you should use natural language processing. So Twitter already lets you see blocked accounts, but it doesn't really let you see the blocked tweets. And what they should do is let users be able to group those tweets and those accounts and send a report or send them to themselves. They should even allow users to, when they see their mentions, select mentions to select a variety of mentions together and say this is related to X thing. Users can then start telling them about any growing or hate abuse campaign, and Twitter can find out about it before it's printed in journalistic outputs. And I know that this is possible because I am a data point to Twitter. There's a lot of information coming from me, from who and how I tweet to people, and Twitter's already catching that data. This is free analytics I got about my own Twitter account. If Twitter can tell me this, then they can definitely start enacting networked, they can definitely sort of enact the PGP Web of Trust. And one other thing is redefine your community guidelines. Community guidelines can reflect new harassment and user trends that are growing within your online community. Language is ever evolving. Hashtag is a real word. Echo, a social network started by Stacey Horn in 1999, would constantly reevaluate rules around joining and harassment. She realized she had transphobic rules and then rewrote them. If we're having those conversations in the 1990s, we can have them now. Your community guidelines should be a living document about the ecosystem of Twitter, and it can be agile in the way the law is not. So Twitter can define what harassment exists online, and they can call it out by name, no doxing or dogpiling. Users need to have a clear understanding for what happens, and users need a clear understanding of consequences for engaging in such behavior, and they need to know what is acceptable. Twitter should protect their new demographics, their small fandoms, and their marginalized users. And I have one last suggestion. They should hire people. They should hire digital ethnographers and UX researchers and media critics and artists, and they should pay them, and they should listen to them. There's more to UX than improving mobile features. Hire people to study languages, microtrends, demographics around the world, and let them make things and let them teach you. And lastly, this is something I really believe in. I believe in everyone's right to freedom of speech. I believe that Gamergate has the right to say whatever they want, whenever they want, on any type of platform. I firmly believe in my right to not listen. I believe in my right to opt out, to turn my back, to dial down the volume, and I believe that I should have affordances to do that. And not giving me those affordances is just really poor design. I dislike metaphors, but I think Twitter is a really decent car with a really bad seatbelt. And as users, we've been engendered, pun intended again, to share more of ourselves and our lives online that benefits Twitter. Our communication methods and styles have evolved technically and sociologically because we live in the age of digital ubiquity and computing. But we're at a point when the solution to online harassment isn't saying share less. That's like saying bleed less when you're thrown through the windshield. We cannot share less because our communication systems were not designed that way. And those designs facilitated and guided the type of communication on those platforms, aka sharing more. We can't do what is so against the nature of the platform. So users need finer controls. Users need better seatbelts. Technology amplifies things. It doesn't make things. Users do, and users are people. People make things, people build, people say, and people emote. And technology is just a tool to aid in that. So let's build better seatbelts. And then that's it. No problem.
Okay, next we have Tommy Rousse. He is a second-year JD PhD student at Northwestern's Media Technology and Society program. He also studied games analysis at the IT University of Copenhagen, and he worked on an award-winning indie game. You're gonna have to help me with this. Laser Knights?
Yeah.
Called Laser Knights. Here's Tommy.
Hey, everybody. So my name is Tommy Rousse, and I'm going to be giving a talk today called Crowdsourcing Justice. It's about the peer production of moral judgment. And to talk a little bit about that question mark, I don't mean to be like a booster exactly for some of these things. I have like a lot of ambivalence about the case studies I'm going to be talking about. And as you'll actually see, like the case studies I'm talking about weren't exactly a gigantic success. So we can talk a little bit about what that means going forward. I really appreciate feedback. If you want to do it anonymously, you can use my AskFM account or contact me on Twitter or by email. So I was partially inspired to look at this kind of stuff by the events of Gamergate. I was involved in a lot of gaming community stuff when I was in Copenhagen pursuing my master's, and I saw a lot of the sort of preciously few women that were involved in gaming get kind of driven out offline and sometimes out of the careers they'd been working on for a decade or more during that time period. And one of the quotes that kind of really resonated with me was when Lee said that when you decline to create or curate a culture in your spaces, you're responsible for what spawns in the vacuum. And by sort of the same token, I was really inspired by one of the professors at my school who wrote about how players are moral beings and they have some kind of responsibility. He wrote this before Gamergate ever happened, but I think it just resonates so much with what's happened since then. Just briefly, because of what I'm talking about, free speech doesn't really come into this because I'm specifically talking about instances of communities and community managers of private corporations or groups dealing with all of their issues internally. So government regulation isn't particularly involved in this instance. So I think one of the major problems here is that we know that some of the most well-capitalized companies in history are responsible for online communities that are positively overrun by harassment. I would say that profit-oriented platform owners tend to under-provision online governance and adjudication resources, and that peer production communities' tendency towards egalitarianism and horizontalism results in under-provision of community governance mechanisms. So what I'm interested in is whether we can realign the interests and responsibilities of owners and users so that they can work together in some way to curb this problem. So what I'm looking at is socio-technical systems that allow users to judge the behavior of their peers and render some kind of judgment after that period. So I'm talking a little bit about crowdsourcing and peer production. Depending on how rigorous you are about those definitions, they can be entirely different or cover the same thing. But I am talking about communities that are sort of all run by volunteers and also communities that are harnessed by some kind of private company and adjudicate from there. So I think there are two major models of community management that I'm going to kind of contrast the rest of my presentation with. And first of all, it's the general model of moderation that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Has anyone in here like moderated a listserv or a Facebook group or anything like that? It's a pretty common experience. So one of the things to ask about that is who really labors during that process and how much is justice worth to whom? So the provision of this kind of arbitration can be very difficult and it can be very expensive. Sorting between conflicting user claims is really time-consuming. And on the other hand, you're sort of responsible for any of these decisions of moderation that your employees make. So T.L. Taylor in 2002 wrote about this case in Sony where they sort of censored some fan fiction, had a huge backlash. It's really common to hear terrible PR stories of like actions of customer service representatives that just really embarrass their companies. And on the other side, you have another push where you know that the value per user as these like massive communities rise has fallen. So in a lot of cases, it's really not cost effective for companies to assign like an employee hours of time to resolve these user disputes. Unfortunately, the other option is sort of like a vigilante approach where the internet is seen as like a wild west. And this is where you have a lot of harassment. Given an under-provision of arbitration, users take matters into their own hands with no accountability, unpredictable results, and cycles of revenge. And it's probably not surprising, given what we've heard about Gamergate, that research suggests that online harassment disproportionately affects marginalized groups. And many communities default to this vigilante approach. If developers of communities and designers of communities don't take some kind of responsibility to put something in, users will find their own solutions. And a lot of times these solutions are both incredibly inventive and incredibly terrible at the same time. So can we turn to some kind of alternative model of administration that isn't platform owners controlling everything and it's not a user free-for-all? So one of the models I think we can turn to is looking at a jury of one's peers, and I'm going to be talking about two examples as I move forward. So once again, what we're talking about is socio-technical systems that allow users to judge the behavior of their peers. And I would say that this has a couple of advantages. First, communities can set their own standards. They can start conversations about acceptable behavior, and it sort of frees them from the over-corporatized construction of speech where everything is sort of only suited for what's profitable to the corporation. On the other hand, from the company's point of view, they're not responsible for providing the necessary labor, and they're not responsible for the decisions that the community make or the decisions of their employees. On the other hand, I'd like to caution that democracy is not an inherent good. If you just have unchecked majoritarianism or just rule by whatever the majority decides, it can squelch minority viewpoints. It can turn into a rule by mob. And then you have the unfortunate situation, especially with already segmented community, of something I like to call a majority of assholes, where people just make decisions that most people would consider to be unethical or immoral. And on the other hand, in many of these spaces, this volunteer labor contributes to the value of a privately held platform. But at this point, what doesn't? So there's a minimalist implementation of this sort of idea, what you might see on something like Reddit or Slashdot, which is upvoting and downvoting and user ratings. But I'm going to be sort of expanding on a broader case. So I'll be talking about two case studies. On one hand, Wikipedia, and on one hand, League of Legends. And the reason why I chose these two particularly is because Wikipedia is like a peer production community. It's open source. It's not run by any corporation. It's generally staffed by volunteers. And League of Legends' tribunal system is a for-profit company in a gaming space. Now, here's why I'm not talking about social media. In social media, you have a much wider range of interaction. Something like Wikipedia or League of Legends, they're sort of instrumental communities. They're built around really specific purposes. In one case, the maintenance of a peer-produced encyclopedia. In the other case, these short online games. Now, there are much larger privacy challenges when you start to introduce everyone's lives onto a social media platform. So both Wikipedia and League of Legends rely on evidence in the forms of transcripts or other logs of bad behavior. If you took that approach and applied it to Twitter or Facebook, any kind of full-text log you have of user behavior is a surefire way to allow the identification of people who have either been reported or who are reviewing information about other users. And that opens up a vector where people who are already experiencing a problem can be exposed to further harassment through the process of arbitration. So I don't think it's that there aren't design solutions to these kind of problems, but it certainly isn't viable to take the kind of systems that I'm talking about here and just sort of wholesale take them and apply them to different communities. There have to be some considerations of how these different communities act and what people put on them. So I'm going to be talking about Wikipedia's request for comment users system. And it's part of like a really elaborate government system in Wikipedia. And within that really elaborate system, you actually have a sort of ecosystem of bans that users can get. So at the top, there's sort of Jimmy Wales, who still has like a vestigial power to ban anyone he wants. There's the arbitration committee, which is now generally seen as the highest level of adjudication. There's a ban by consensus model, which is similar to what I'm going to discuss, but involves more participation by higher ranked members of the community, like administrators. There's the request for comment user system, and the Wikimedia Foundation also reserves the right to ban people. So the process of the request for comment / users is that basically it's intended as a model for average Wikipedia editors to get together and talk about the behavior of problematic users who have sort of demonstrated patterns of negative behavior for long periods of time. So it's intended to be non-binding. It's open to all editors. 2 editors, before the case is certified and open to discussion, are supposed to talk to the user in question and try to resolve the dispute before anything like this takes place. And then there's a comment period of about 30 days. So while there are some success stories, unfortunately, in the vast majority of cases, the accused editor doesn't cooperate, community members lose interest before the 30-day period is complete, or the process sort of devolves into heated arguments between factions. So something that was intended to be a request for comment sort of turns into something a little more similar to a request for conflict. I'm going to share with you some of the reports from the users as they discussed what should be done about the system. So one user says, "Our current method seems to be like putting someone in the village stocks, where the only thing you're allowed to throw at them are prickly cacti, and they must be thrown with bare hands. This leads to editors with sore hands and one with a sore face. This is not productive to resolving conduct issues." Just a quick warning, the next slide uses a word with a terrible history of racial injustice in the United States. So what eventually happened is there was a way of sort of commenting on what this process had devolved into by using a redirect, which is used in Wikipedia as a way to sort of farcically name something otherwise what it was intended to be. So they renamed the redirect for the request for comment to lynch. And this lasted for maybe a week before the community deleted it. So they ended up having a really long discussion about what should be done about this system. And here's another user saying that the sad reality is that Wikipedia's justice system is far closer to a kangaroo court than it is the Supreme Court. The intrinsic nature of the process rewarded vote stacking, canvassing, and worse. Too often, sock masters, people who control sock puppets, and people with few edits were dominating the process, making it not only unfair, but an actual disgrace as a process. Cliques would vote en masse in order to make an apparent consensus, which never actually existed. And so after a 22,000 word debate, request for comment users was abolished on December 8th, 2014, during the time in which I was writing one of my final papers on it. Okay, so the other case I'm going to talk about is the Tribunal. And just to give you a quick primer on League of Legends, right now it's the most popular multiplayer online battle arena game. Depending on who you ask, it may be the most popular online game in the world. A majority of matches are 5-on-5 with semi-random assembled teams. And what that means is compared to a one-on-one game format, a negative player has a 900% greater ability to ruin other players' experiences. So from a game design perspective, this is a really serious problem. It sort of explains why this genre of games has a really negative reputation. So like many online communities, the Tribunal allows users to report negative behavior. However, it also allows other players to judge and punish their peers. And the way this started is that Riot decided to hire a number of behavioral scientists, headed up by Jeffrey Lin, who has a PhD in neuroscience, to regulate player behavior. So it opened up in 2011, and their stated goal was to give the community the opportunity to govern itself. Players were initially incentivized with in-game currency. Unfortunately, that encouraged gaming the system and other abuse, so it's done by a volunteer basis now. And the way Riot framed this was as a discussion between toxicity and sportsmanship. So they never actually formally define what they mean by these two terms, but these are the phrases they use and encourage players to discuss in these terms negative and positive behavior. So the way the system works is after a player has been reported multiple times in categories like offensive language, intentionally losing, or berating teammates, the tribunal compiles a case through an algorithmic process. And then these provide a transcript of what's happened in the games to people who volunteer to review them. So volunteers review these transcripts and vote on whether or not players should be punished or pardoned, and customer service review looks over their final decisions. So the results of this is that in 2011, this is when the system first came out, 1.4% of players were punished, 94% that were reported were punished, 70 average votes per case were decided upon, and 50% of punished players didn't reoffend. So Jeffrey Lynn has given 2 presentations at the last 2 GDCs about the tribunal and what other people in the game industry can learn about it. And according to Riot, this has been just a phenomenal success for them. However, despite Riot's reports of success from the tribunal system, they ultimately concluded that using human adjudicators isn't fast enough. And what they ended up doing is pretty interesting. They took the body of data they had accumulated through this tribunal system, set a machine learning algorithm on it, and developed an algorithm that was able to basically reproduce the results of a jury almost instantaneously. I'm really curious as to what the results of this is going to be when systems like this can be applied outside of video games and in our more normal everyday life activities. I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and give up the floor now. I look forward to your questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Tommy. Okay, so finally we have Sky Croeser. She is at Curtin University in the Department of Net Studies in Western Australia, and her research focuses on how activists use and also shape technology. She's also the author of the book Global Justice and the Politics of Information, The Struggle Over Knowledge.
Okay. Sorry, I don't usually use Macs, so... Oh, that looks like the thing we want it to look like. Okay, so I am going to cover quite a lot of ground here today and hopefully just open up some points that people can come find me if they want it to be expanded. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about digital liberties activism and politics in an attempt to avoid jargon and people needing pre-existing knowledge. And then we're going to move from there on to looking at some of the challenges that Geek Feminism raises to digital liberties activism and some of the alternative ways it is exploring for approaching governance in online spaces. So the digital liberties movement is something I have written about in other places, and so has Hector Postiga, although he called it the digital rights movement. This is, very broadly speaking, a network of organizations and individuals that are working for user control of digital technologies and networks. So that encompasses a range of different technologies. Generally, they oppose restrictive copyright, so the continual extension of copyright terms over music, movies, books, etc. They oppose technical controls on sharing materials, so the controls that mean that you can't play a DVD from one region in another region. They oppose online censorship and surveillance, and they're in favor of alternatives like copyleft and Creative Commons, free and open source software, and tools for secure online communications. There are a specific set of politics that go along with this movement, and as usual, when you're talking about social movements, you need to insert a lot of caveats. There are a lot of people who are associated with the movement whose individual politics are different, don't fit this in one way or another. Many different perspectives involved here. So I am talking about the kinds of politics that are most visible and most influential within the movement, associated with organizations that have kind of the most discursive power and the most money and so on. So generally speaking, the politics of digital liberties activism fits within a liberal democratic framework. There are frequently challenges to aspects of the existing political systems, But they usually refer back to liberal ideals. So, for example, activists might challenge state surveillance by appealing to concepts like freedom of association and freedom of speech, rather than by challenging the idea of the state itself and the state's right to exist and enforce national security or enforce the law over people. So, broadly speaking, what this translates into is a really strong focus on individual freedoms, particularly negative freedom, which means freedom from censorship, freedom from surveillance, and so on, rather than freedom to. So that would be like access to employment, access to food, health, that kind of thing. They focus on tactics that aim at reform rather than much deeper structural change. And they make quite frequent attempts to frequent appeals to an idealized free market. So, for example, people will talk about how we need to stop these restrictive copyright terms because they're creating monopolies in the content industries like music and movies and so on that are uncompetitive. And if we change these rules, then we'd have a much more competitive market, which would be great for everybody because that's how the market is. So geek feminism, a lot of geek feminists have actually come out of this movement or even are still involved with this movement. Women have been key to the framing, campaigning, and to specific projects within digital liberties activism. So, for example, women have, including those who identify as feminists and those who definitely do not, have had an active presence in the free and open source software communities, in campaigns against online censorship and surveillance, in other spaces like Crypto Party. However, many of the women who were initially involved in the movement have raised really important criticisms of it, and others have never found the movement to represent their experiences of online technologies. Mary Buchholz has written some early work on geek feminism in which she looked specifically at female hackers, but the Geek Feminist Wiki, which is one but not the only hub for geek feminism, defines this much more broadly, talking about geek communities as referring to science and technology, gaming, science fiction, fandom, and many other areas. So geek feminists do work in a lot of different areas, not all of them related to internet activism, but here I am talking mostly about how this applies to internet governance. And I note here that I am talking more specifically about geek feminists from North America and also from Australia. We exist. So there are really some important cultural, historical, and political differences between what's happening in North America and Australia and what's happening in European communities, which I will go into in a future paper. But you could check out Sophie Tupin's work if you're interested in that. So broadly speaking, geek feminist politics, which comes with the usual caveats about how social movements are messy and fluid and contain many different perspectives, has an emerging set of ideals. And I think often geek feminists do refer back to liberal ideals because those are the ideals that are most visible and accessible to us in our liberal democratic society. So Alex Bailey, who is one of the co-founders of the Geek Feminism Wiki, says that when she first began the wiki, she had no education in feminism, in gender studies, in the humanities generally, and so the wiki was partly a space to host her own self-education. And this isn't particularly unusual even today, with many women in the geek feminist movement coming from technical backgrounds in which the only kind of activist politics present might be those around free software. However, with the advent of resources like the Geek Feminism Wiki and spaces like Ada Camp, and also a growing geek feminist consciousness expressed in online discussions and in other spaces, this is helping to build a more specific but still fluid, heterogeneous politics. This also happens around key events. So, for example, Alex Bailey has talked about the way in which the 2009 race fail discussions about race and racism in science fiction and fandom helped to build geek feminist consciousness around issues related to racism, which many people might not have explored before. So one of the key features that's been emerging over the last few years is an interest in intersectionality, which is an understanding of gendered oppression as intersecting with other forms of oppression. This concept was initially developed specifically in the context of black feminism by people like Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Hill Collins, Bell Hooks, and others. But it's much more broadly and sometimes also more shallowly understood in the context of geek feminism today. So I think one of the key flashpoints for understanding the differences and challenges that geek feminism raises with digital liberties activism is around free speech. Concerns about free speech are really central to the work of many digital liberties activists and organizations, and are often the primary framework that they're using to talk about the work that they're doing and kind of the primary value that they keep coming back to. At the same time, free speech is something that is used, is mobilized against women who have problems with harassment online. And this is often defined in a very expansive way. So, as Tom noted, free speech, as it's kind of most narrowly defined, only refers to the government censoring of people or government repression of people for their publicly stated ideas. But often people mobilize this discourse of free speech when any form of moderation or banning is coming up in online communities. And I think this can be seen partly as the result of implementing the values of liberal democracy in spaces beyond the state. So in other words, seeing the governance of an online community or of Twitter or of Facebook or of any other space, particular forum, as needing to follow the same model as how we manage the state. And I think this blog post brings up some of the issues with that model. So Jem Yoshioka has said that the fervent devotion to free speech over everything else ends up alienating me. Yes, I believe in the vital importance of freedom of the press and the freedom from being censored, prosecuted, or incarcerated by governments based on the expression of thoughts. But I also believe that harmful and dangerous abusive behavior by individuals and hate groups needs to be identified and actively stamped out. It needs to be the responsibility of us all, not just the people who find themselves targeted. This is the responsibility that we take on as members of a community. And I think that highlighted section underlies a key shift. This is a shift towards a more communitarian approach, where we see the community as a whole as needing to deal with structural violence and structural inequality, rather than seeing that as being up to the individual themselves or up to some kind of a top-down structure to just refrain from repression. But geek feminism's work in this area, or I guess the theorizing that geek feminists are doing in themselves, I think could really productively draw on some other traditions of praxis, so the combination of theory and action that women in similar communities are experiencing. So there are other communities of women who have had to deal with these issues of like, how do we deal with harassment, abuse, exclusion, structural inequality within spaces that are organized horizontally or in a decentralized way? How do we build spaces that invite participation and inclusion rather than just refraining from overt top-down repression? And how do we do this within male-dominated cultures and also within the context of capitalism and like a very particular political framework that surrounds us? And obviously, if you're familiar with your bisected flags, you will gather that I think that the experience of anarcho-feminists and queer anarchists has a lot to offer in these discussions, because these are the issues that they have been dealing with for decades and centuries now.
You can really clap now. Thank you all so much. Do we have a Hashmod report?
Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot to your report other than kind of the usual live tweeting. There weren't really like specific questions, but I did favorite a couple of things that I thought was good sort of back channel pieces. So one of the things was someone at BTRSTZ tweeted when platforms take steps to limit bad actions, they expose themselves to more legal liability for malfeasance that gets through. I think that was in reference to Tommy, great. Sorry, I can't forget your name. And then also kind of interesting thoughts just from the organizers of the conference. I don't know if I'll say this a lot, but about whether or not to include names and photos on the website, how that wasn't a requirement for the conference, but maybe that wasn't super clear initially. And yeah, that was pretty much the highlights as far as stuff that wasn't actually happening in the room.
Okay, thanks. If anyone has a question, do you want to line up for them? If you have a question, why don't you come down in the middle here, and I can give you the mic. But I have a question actually at first, which is, I was really struck, Caroline, by the end of your presentation, where you were basically like, why doesn't Twitter hire someone like me? And it does seem like the people who have the best ideas for how to crack down on harassment on a lot of these platforms don't work for them, with the possible exception of Riot Games going that way. So I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about what the relationship is between tech companies and the academics who are studying them.
Because I can try to start. I think a lot of it is that like a lot of our social media networks are really, really large companies, and I think that at a certain point it kind of feels like I think they think a waste of their time to sort of hire a user researcher when actual problems that like bring them money would be like user interface problems, such as like having there be not specific features on Android. But I think like it's a crazy thing because Etsy puts a lot of their money into studying their online user groups and their fandoms, and they have a very large user research section as a part of their UX team, and they spend a lot of money studying trends. And Etsy's a great example of that, but it also makes sense. It's important for Etsy, which has a specific identity of being kind of homegrown and being local and homemade or vintage, to understand how to talk to their users as they grow to be an even larger and larger company. And I actually I honestly don't have a good reason as to why this isn't a thing that companies engage in. They should, because a lot of, I think the most interesting data that's coming from users is not like marketing data, it's how they talk. Like if you're a telecommunications company like Twitter, what's more interesting is how people use your platform to engage in new types of conversation, the way that they meet people, and less like a way of how do we sell them shoes. And the funny thing is if you study how people talk to each other, it gets easier to market to them. So it's kind of true though. If you study how people interact and then the amount of interaction they have, which is actually a thing I'm working on at IBM Watson, is I'm starting a project that's going to study the robustness of amounts of interactions between users to sort of see if you can start to define between interaction amount, if that's a safe interaction, like if it's a follower versus a non-safe interaction. And I think a lot of it's just sort of, we built these systems without realizing how big they were going to get, so we built them wrong. And then now the way to kind of fix it is like, how can we build code on top of code on top of code on top of code? At least that's my theory.
So one of the things that I forgot to mention, but I should have, is that Jeffrey Lynn, the lead designer of the Tribunal, has mentioned that one of the things about the Tribunal is a lot of people on Twitter think it's like this huge cost-cutting measure, sort of bring computers in so you don't have to hire a bunch of people. But actually, according to Riot, it's been tremendously expensive, and much more expensive than it would have been for customer service. But on the other hand, like if there are programs like this that are successful, hopefully they can be exported to other systems.
I think that it's also important to remember the role of capitalism here. So the idea is, well, you can reform the system by redesigning bits of it, but this is a system that is fundamentally not designed to keep everyone safe. It's a system that's designed for profit. And so the structural inequalities that you see, for example, in Twitter and in the tech industry more generally, like the fact that they don't hire people of color and they don't hire women, and that therefore those experiences are not represented in the design, isn't an accident.
Totally.
It's part of a bigger structural issue. And definitely we should be trying to do things about that now, but also we need to be trying to think about spaces in which workers will have more control over what they're making and be making stuff that is produced for our communities by our communities rather than for making a profit.
Okay.
Tommy, a question for you mainly, but also probably because you're the person across the panel. I'm interested in the way you picked your case studies, because both of those are highly masculinized environments, and whether you have any thoughts on how that compares to environments like maybe NC or even the archive of Brain that are very different in terms of gender makeup.
Yeah, they're also extremely English censored as well. And yeah, I mean, I started the League of Legends stuff while I was working on video games, and the main reason why I used Wikipedia is because I thought it was a very different example. And also that Wikipedia has all of its access to data. Like, the only thing we really know about Riot is what Riot has told us about this system. I'd really like to expand this and include many more communities. But right now I'm still at a really early stage in the research.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Much better.
So I just start by saying thank you so much, all of you, for being really time on it, sort of taking notes very rushingly. I wanted to draw on the point that you made, Caroline, around Twitter needs to hire more people and really think about the user experience, but also talking about this idea of it's a capitalist system, and so should we be trying to build other Twitter? Should we be trying to build systems that aren't built on this sort of capitalist system? And I know there have been lots of different attempts to make alternate Facebooks or alternate Twitters. There's that whole idea of you need to have a mass movement.
Totally.
So, I mean, and this is sort of a question for all of you. Do you have ideas about where do we go from here, basically? We know what's wrong, but what's next?
Yeah. Oh, thanks. I think Elo got really close. Like, there was literally a 1 month period where I was checking that all the time. And I think we can build new systems. I just think the UX has to be really good, and Elo is really, really poor. Like, Elo didn't have blocking, it didn't tell you about notifications, right? Like, all these affordances and things that we've been taught that should be in a social network, like, we're not in Elo. But we got close with that, and the reason Elo's fallen off is really because people logged on and couldn't see any change. They couldn't see replies to things they had posted. They couldn't see actionable social data they had missed while they were gone, which we can see on Twitter and on Facebook, and we can see on Instagram. And so, I think we can make new systems that are iffy capitalism systems. Like, Elo wanted to make money and it received VC funding, and it was a little quiet about that, which it probably shouldn't have been. But I think we can make new platforms. I think a bigger thing is understanding that we maybe will not have these monolithic, huge, institutional platforms that we currently have. And I think it's kind of being okay with that, because I think a lot of people in this room would probably go to smaller social networks if they existed. And I think maybe the idea of creating social networks that are smaller, more centered on specific identities could exist. They just need to be designed well.
I mean, this is just a brief point, but I think, for me at least, looking for an idealized version of the internet is sort of like an exercise in futility. I think the best thing to do is keep dialogue open, because it's just like in any sort of political realm, there's going to be, and even with, I don't really know Elo, I don't know this stuff very well, I'm one of the only people with even, without a hashtag, I don't know this stuff very well, so I come from an amateur's perspective, but it seems to me that the smaller you get, the more you create voices that are just like your own, and so you're almost losing the globalized modalities, what's actually particularly attractive about the internet. And so it's more just, it's sort of this double-edged sword. I don't think there's really a solution here. I think there's just dialogue, and that's really it. And that's sort of the same sort of solution in any other political world. The more we look for an idealized version, the less we'll actually come closer to ideal something. I know it sounds really theoretical and strange, but it's just, to me, it seems like a flawed project, maybe. But
I also think that shift is already happening, and I saw some interesting tweets from somewhere else about the dark dark Twitter. And I think that especially as people become more embattled in spaces like Twitter, we are shifting towards other private spaces. So a lot of the people I know, both feminist activists and anarchist activists in unsafe places, are shifting towards IRC channels or other spaces that aren't as easily modified at the same time as people will use Facebook or Twitter to reach a broader audience when they need to. So it's not like, not necessarily what do we do next, but how do we keep doing the things we're doing and do it more effectively.
I think one of the issues is that as these social networks are sort of relied on the goodwill of their users to get really big, have become more profit-oriented and more highly capitalized, they're really restricting access to data, and they're becoming much more conservative about what they do. So seeing these companies sort of give more access to data, stop sort of closing out their APIs to allow users to access their own data, and sort of opening up research to outside parties that they can then freely publish is a really important part of that process and moving forward.
Yeah. There's so many wires.
I think like Slack's a great example of like an unintentional
I just have
social
a question because I see kind of there's something missing for me, which is that there's been a lot of discussion of regulating and policing and how to kind of control what's happening on the internet and user experience. And I think my question is sort of how to think about what kind of behavior is actually is being produced by the internet and what kind of behavior is being permitted by the internet, right? So the idea that anonymity or I don't know, or access to information about somebody you want to stop enables something, but is there something also being, how do we distinguish sort of conceptually between that and the kinds of harassment and bad behavior and whatever that act is on college campuses where people can anonymously say racist things? So is that something that's like already there and the internet allows, or is that something that is being produced by these technologies? And I think Allison was sort of getting at that with the discussion of literary form and that the kind of formlessness of the internet might produce actually a different kind of meaningscape or something. Anyway, thanks.
Oh, well, I mean, yes, I agree. I don't really have much to add to that, but yeah, it's basically the idea that, at least for me, it seems like there are forms of abuse, yes, that are definitely produced by the internet, and it's a new form, it's new experiences that, for me personally, I never thought I would actually engage with. But I think these are definitely versions, just like with anything else that the internet reproduces, it's a version that's obviously has some root in our everyday life, our organic experiences. But it does allow, like what you were saying versus Twitter. Twitter's versus something what I've experienced is somewhat different because it's literally abuse limited to the cyber world. So it's abused and abuser together created in the cyber world, as opposed to someone using the cyber world to aggress against someone in the real world, someone without a hashtag, someone without any defense mechanism. Yeah, there's two. So maybe there is something literally produced by.
I mean, not to sort of sound like a broken record, but I think we sort of built the internet without really understanding like what would come out of it. I mean, the internet was sort of built in the case of like a nuclear fallout, right? So like government agencies could talk to each other, and then more people started using it. And the communication that was built on top of the internet was really built by a group of like different groups of white guys, right? And this all came out of like the 80s and 90s. So I think one thing to really keep in mind is that we built a broken internet without realizing that it was broken. Like, we're learning now about online harassment, and I feel like a broken record, but like we have really, really bad tools, and these tools are things we use every day and they shape our lives. So like, if you don't add in affordances or you don't add in certain rules, like people will use them to this extent. So like what's being generated on the internet is what the internet, it's what the platform of the internet is allowing, because this is the way the internet was built. So it's sort of hard to say like online harassment is a problem of the internet. It's just a result of the way we built it. Does that kind of make sense? Like we have this sort of weird communication with unknown people because this is how we structured the internet, and this is how things were then built on top of it. We've been using them
we have. Thank you all so much for coming.
Tommy, is there a version of law that you study? It's called like
I really enjoyed your, well, I mean, like, I was horrified and interested.
The program I'm in is called Media Technology and
Well,
Society.
it was kind of this thing of like, what
But
do
it's
I do? And I'm like, I'm just gonna have to be honest about it.
I'm starting in the fall, so I don't actually